My sister Victoria stood in the funeral home parking lot demanding half of everything our mother had left me, threatening to contest the will and destroy our family's reputation if I refused. What she did not know was that Mom had anticipated every manipulative move Victoria would make, and the documents waiting in the lawyer's office would reveal truths that would leave my sister speechless and change both our lives forever. This is the story of how I discovered my own strength and learned that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my mother's funeral began with rain, the kind of steady downpour that seemed to mirror the grief that had settled into my bones during the 3 weeks since her passing. I stood at my bedroom window in the small apartment I had been renting for the past 2 years, watching water stream down the glass and blur the world outside into indistinct shapes. My mother, Elena Hartfield, had died at the age of 62 after a brief but aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis had come only 4 months before her death, leaving barely enough time to process the reality before she was gone. Those final 4 months had been the most intense and emotionally draining period of my life. I had taken a leave of absence from my position as a graphic designer at a modest marketing firm to care for Mom full-time. The decision had not been difficult despite the financial strain it created. My mother had raised me and my older sister Victoria largely on her own after our father passed away from a heart attack when I was 8 years old. She had worked 2 jobs to keep us housed and fed, had attended every school event despite exhaustion, had sacrificed her own comfort and opportunities to ensure we had chances she never received. When she needed care during her final months, there was no question about where I would be. Victoria had a different perspective on filial obligation. My sister, who was 5 years older than my 32 years, had built what she considered a successful life in the city, working in pharmaceutical sales and married to a man named Robert who came from a wealthy family. She lived in an expensive neighborhood, drove a luxury car, and maintained a social media presence that suggested a life of enviable prosperity and happiness. When Mom received her diagnosis, Victoria had expressed concern and sadness, but she had also made clear that her career responsibilities and family obligations to Robert and their 2 children meant she could not be present for day-to-day caregiving. I had not resented this initially. Victoria had always been the ambitious one, the sister who knew how to navigate social situations and present herself in ways that opened doors. I had been the quieter one, more comfortable with creative work than with networking and self-promotion. Our different personalities had created some distance between us over the years, but I had assumed our fundamental bond as sisters remained intact beneath surface differences. The reality of Mom's final months had tested that assumption. Victoria had visited twice during the 4-month period, each visit lasting only a few hours and marked by her obvious discomfort with the medical equipment, the medication schedules, and the physical reality of terminal illness. She had brought expensive flower arrangements and gift baskets that seemed more appropriate for impressing observers than for comforting a dying woman. She had taken photographs during her visits that she posted to social media with captions about cherishing family and making memories, creating public narrative of devoted daughter that bore little resemblance to her actual minimal presence. Meanwhile, I had been living the unglamorous reality of end-of-life care. I had learned to manage pain medications and navigate insurance bureaucracy. I had held Mom's hand through nights when pain made sleep impossible and fear made the darkness seem overwhelming. I had listened to her stories about her childhood, her marriage to our father, her hopes and regrets about how she had lived her life. I had been present for the gradual diminishment of the vibrant, strong woman who had raised us into someone increasingly fragile and dependent. During those long nights and difficult days, Mom had talked to me about many things she had never discussed before. She had shared her observations about both her daughters and the paths our lives had taken. She had expressed pride in my creativity and kindness, but also concern that I allowed others to take advantage of these qualities. She had acknowledged Victoria's drive and social skills, but also noted patterns of selfishness and manipulation that she feared had been reinforced rather than corrected over the years. These conversations had been painful in their honesty. Mom had admitted that she had perhaps been too lenient with Victoria's self-centered behavior when we were young, too quick to excuse actions that should have been addressed. She had also admitted that she had perhaps expected too much patience and understanding from me, allowing Victoria to overshadow me because I was easier and less demanding. She had tried to balance her attention between two very different daughters and feared she had failed both of us in different ways. One conversation during the final week of her life had been particularly significant, though I had not fully understood its importance at the time. Mom had asked me to bring her a locked box she kept in her bedroom closet. When I retrieved it, she had removed several documents and asked me to read them carefully after she was gone. She had explained that she had tried to be fair in her estate planning, but that fairness did not always mean equality. She had made decisions that she believed were right even though they would likely cause conflict. She had asked me to trust that she had her reasons and to be strong when that conflict emerged. I had promised to trust her judgment, though I had been confused about what conflict she anticipated. At that point, I had assumed her estate would be modest and would likely be divided equally between Victoria and myself. Mom had lived frugally despite working hard throughout her life, and I had not expected there would be substantial assets to inherit. The house she had owned had been mortgaged during our childhood to cover expenses, and I had believed she was still making payments. Her car was old, her possessions were modest, and she had never given any indication of having significant savings or investments. Mom had passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 days after that conversation, with me holding her hand in the hospice facility where she had spent her final week. Victoria had not arrived in time despite being notified when Mom's condition deteriorated rapidly. She had been attending a work conference out of state, and had explained that she could not leave immediately due to professional obligations. She had arrived 8 hours after Mom died, distraught and emotional in ways that seemed performative rather than genuine to my exhausted, grief-stricken eyes. The 3 weeks between Mom's death and the funeral had been consumed with the practical tasks that death requires. I had made arrangements with the funeral home, notified relatives and friends, drafted the obituary, selected the casket, chosen the flowers, and managed the hundreds of small decisions that someone must make when a person dies. Victoria had been involved in these decisions nominally, offering opinions and preferences, but the actual work of implementing choices and managing logistics had fallen to me. During this period, Victoria had made several comments about Mom's estate that had struck me as premature and oddly focused given our recent loss. She had asked whether I had found Mom's will and what it contained. She had questioned whether Mom had life insurance and what the payout would be. She had suggested that we would need to sell Mom's house quickly to divide the proceeds. She had framed these questions as practical concerns about managing estate affairs, but there had been an edge of entitlement and assumption in her tone that made me uncomfortable. I had not yet reviewed the documents Mom had asked me to read. The emotional weight of grief had made it difficult to focus on practical matters, and I had been postponing the task of engaging with the formal legal aspects of her death. I knew there was a will because Mom had mentioned its existence, but I had assumed it was straightforward and would simply divide whatever modest assets existed between Victoria and myself equally. The morning of the funeral, as I prepared to leave my apartment, I finally opened the envelope Mom had given me during her final week. Inside were several documents including a copy of her will, a personal letter addressed to me, and what appeared to be financial statements from accounts I had not known existed. I had only a few minutes before I needed to leave for the funeral home, so I quickly scanned the documents without fully processing their contents. What I saw in those brief minutes made my heart race and my hands tremble. The will did not divide assets equally. The financial statement showed accounts with balances far exceeding anything I had imagined Mom possessed. The personal letter began with words that suggested she had been keeping significant secrets from both her daughters for many years. I did not have time to read everything carefully or to understand the full implications, but I realized that Mom had been right about conflict being inevitable. Victoria was going to be very unhappy when the contents of this will were revealed. I drove to the funeral home in a state of emotional turbulence that went beyond grief. I was mourning my mother while simultaneously trying to process the revelation that she had apparently lived a financial life completely different from what I had believed. I was anticipating conflict with my sister while preparing to say final goodbye to the woman who had shaped both our lives. I felt unprepared for what was coming even as I understood there was no way to adequately prepare for it. The funeral service was well attended by friends, neighbors and former colleagues who had known Mom throughout her life. Many people approached me to share memories and express condolences, describing acts of kindness and support Mom had provided over the years. I heard stories I had never known about financial help she had quietly given to struggling families, about emotional support she had offered to friends facing difficulties, about volunteer work she had done without ever mentioning it to her daughters. Each story revealed dimensions of my mother's life that had existed beyond my awareness, suggesting that the financial secrets I had just discovered were only one aspect of a complex interior life she had kept private. Victoria was also receiving condolences, playing the role of grieving daughter with practiced skill. She had dressed impeccably in an expensive black dress and designer accessories. Her makeup was perfect despite artfully placed tear tracks that suggested deep emotion. She embraced people with displays of sorrow that seemed calculated for maximum impact on observers. I watched her performance with a mixture of sadness and resentment, recognizing that even at our mother's funeral, Victoria was more concerned with maintaining her image than with genuine grieving. After the service concluded and guests began departing, Victoria approached me with an expression that I could not quite read. There was grief in her face but also something harder, more purposeful. She suggested we speak privately before leaving the funeral home, and I followed her to a small side room where we could talk without being overheard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria closed the door and turned to face me with sudden intensity that contrasted sharply with the gentle sorrow she had been projecting for guests. She told me that we needed to discuss Mom's estate immediately, and could not afford to delay practical matters simply because we were grieving. She said that she had been thinking about fair distribution of assets, and had concluded that anything Mom left should be divided equally between us regardless of what any will might specify. She argued that as daughters who had both lost their mother, we had equal claim to inheritance and equal right to benefit from Mom's life's work. I felt confusion at this sudden shift from funeral mourning to financial negotiation. I asked why she was bringing this up now, before we had even finished the burial, before we knew what assets actually existed. Victoria's expression hardened further as she explained that she knew I had been caring for Mom during her final months, and might therefore believe I deserved greater share of inheritance. She wanted to establish clearly, before any legal processes began, that she would not accept unequal distribution. She had her own family to support, her own financial needs, and her own legitimate claim as Mom's daughter. The presumption underlying Victoria's speech was breathtaking. She was assuming that any will giving me larger share was unfair manipulation taking advantage of my proximity during Mom's final months. She was framing her demand for equal division as protecting against my potential greed, rather than expressing her own entitlement. She was positioning herself as the reasonable party establishing fair terms while implicitly accusing me of attempting to claim more than my rightful share. I felt anger rising through my grief and exhaustion. This was my sister, someone I had loved and looked up to throughout my childhood despite our differences. We were standing in a funeral home having just buried our mother, and she was threatening me over money she knew nothing about while assuming the worst about my character and intentions. The contrast between the sister I had wanted to believe existed, and the person actually standing before me was devastating in its clarity. I told Victoria that I was not going to discuss estate matters at Mom's funeral, and that she would need to wait for the formal will reading like everyone else. This response clearly angered her. She insisted that there was no reason to wait, that we could settle everything between ourselves without involving lawyers and creating unnecessary complications. She said that if I was being difficult about reasonable equal division, she would have no choice but to contest whatever will existed and fight for her fair share regardless of what it cost in legal fees or family harmony. The threat was unmistakable. Victoria was informing me that she was prepared to wage legal battle if I did not immediately agree to give her half of everything. She was assuming she had leverage because she had greater financial resources to fund litigation, and because she believed I would avoid conflict if possible. She was counting on my tendency toward accommodation, and my desire to preserve family relationships, even when those relationships were harmful. Something shifted in me during that conversation in the funeral home side room. Perhaps it was grief stripping away my usual conflict avoidance. Perhaps it was anger at Victoria's timing and presumption. Perhaps it was the memory of Mom asking me to be strong when conflict emerged. Whatever the cause, I found myself responding with directness that surprised both of us. I told Victoria that Mom had made her own decisions about her estate, and that those decisions would be honored regardless of whether Victoria approved. I said that Mom had been clear-minded and intentional in her planning, and that her choices deserved respect. I informed Victoria that there would be a formal will reading scheduled by Mom's attorney, and that all questions would be answered at that time. I made clear that I would not be intimidated or manipulated into agreements that contradicted Mom's explicit wishes. Victoria's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise at my uncharacteristic firmness, anger at being refused, calculation as she reassessed her approach. She asked what I knew about the will's contents, what Mom had told me, whether there was some reason I was being so protective. I could see her mind working, trying to determine whether my resistance indicated that I knew something advantageous to myself that I was trying to protect. I did not answer her questions. I simply repeated that everything would be addressed at the will reading, and that I was leaving the funeral home. I walked past her and out of the room, hearing her follow and continue pressing for information I was not going to provide. Other guests were still in the main area, and Victoria could not create a scene without undermining the grieving daughter image she had been cultivating. She was forced to let me leave while maintaining composed facade for observers. I drove away from the funeral home feeling emotionally wrung out but also strangely empowered. I had stood firm against Victoria's manipulation for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. I had refused to be pressured into immediate accommodation despite her threats and despite my own discomfort with conflict. I had honored Mom's request to trust her judgment and be strong when challenged. That evening, alone in my apartment, I finally read all the documents Mom had left for me with the careful attention they deserved. What I discovered in those pages would explain everything about Victoria's demands and everything about why Mom had structured her will the way she had. The revelations would prove that Mom had understood her daughters better than either of us had realized and had made provisions based on that understanding. The formal will reading was scheduled for the following week in the office of Mom's attorney, a woman named Patricia Morrison who had handled Mom's legal affairs for many years. The week between the funeral and the will reading was marked by increasing tension as Victoria repeatedly contacted me demanding information and threatening legal action if the will did not meet her expectations of fairness. I did not respond to most of these communications, following the advice Patricia had given me when I met with her privately to review the documents. Patricia had explained that Mom had anticipated conflict and had structured both the will and the surrounding circumstances to address it as directly as possible. She had advised me to say nothing to Victoria before the formal reading, to let the documents speak for themselves, and to be prepared for significant emotional reaction when the full truth emerged. As I prepared to attend the will reading, I reflected on the relationship between the sister I had grown up with and the person Victoria had become. I thought about the moments in our childhood when her selfishness had been evident but excusable as immaturity. I remembered the gradual realization during our adult years that those characteristics had not been outgrown, but rather had been refined into more sophisticated forms of manipulation. I acknowledged the grief I felt not just for Mom's death, but for the loss of the sister relationship I had wanted but never actually possessed. The will reading would be a moment of truth in multiple senses. Victoria would learn how Mom had actually structured her estate and why. I would discover whether I had the strength to maintain boundaries against my sister's inevitable fury. We would both confront realities about our family and ourselves that had been obscured by years of unexamined assumptions and comfortable fictions. What neither of us fully understood yet was that the will reading would reveal more than just financial distributions. It would expose secrets Mom had kept for decades, truths that would reframe our understanding of our entire family history, and information that would explain Victoria's behavior in ways that were both more understandable and more unforgivable than either of us had imagined. The transformation that began for me at Mom's funeral was just beginning. The journey ahead would test my resilience, challenge my assumptions, and ultimately teach me lessons about family, justice, and self-worth that would shape the rest of my life. This was not just about inheritance or money. It was about discovering who I was capable of becoming when I stopped accommodating others at the expense of my own truth and dignity. The week following our mother's funeral stretched before me like a minefield where every step required careful consideration. Victoria's demands had escalated from pointed questions to increasingly aggressive phone calls and text messages that arrived at all hours. She had apparently decided that wearing down my resistance through persistent contact was her best strategy for extracting information about the will's contents before the official reading. Each message carried the same underlying theme. She deserved half of everything, any arrangement to the contrary was unfair, and she would fight whatever provisions Mom had made if they did not align with her expectations. I found myself experiencing a strange combination of emotional states during those days. The grief over losing Mom remained fresh and overwhelming at unexpected moments. I would be going through routine tasks when suddenly a memory would surface, triggering tears and a profound sense of loss that made it difficult to breathe. At the same time, I was discovering an unfamiliar sense of clarity and determination that seemed to grow stronger each time Victoria attempted to manipulate or intimidate me. It was as though Mom's death had stripped away some protective layer that had previously prevented me from seeing situations clearly or responding to them with appropriate strength. The documents Mom had left me contained revelations that had fundamentally altered my understanding of our family history and my mother's life. Reading through them carefully during the quiet evenings alone in my apartment, I had pieced together a story that was both surprising and, in retrospect, explained numerous mysteries I had never thought to question. Mom had not been the financially struggling single mother I had always believed her to be. She had been a woman of considerable means who had chosen to live modestly while quietly building wealth through careful investments and property acquisitions over decades. The house I had grown up in, which I had assumed was mortgaged and represented Mom's primary asset, was actually just one of 4 properties she owned outright. The other 3 were rental properties in appreciating neighborhoods that generated steady income streams. Beyond the real estate holdings, Mom had maintained investment accounts with conservative, but consistent growth strategies that had compounded over 30 years into substantial portfolios. The financial statements showed assets totaling just over $2 million. A figure so far beyond anything I had imagined that I had needed to read it multiple times to accept it as real. Even more surprising than the existence of this wealth was the explanation for why Mom had concealed it from her daughters. The personal letter she had written to me explained her reasoning with the kind of clear-eyed understanding of human nature that I was only beginning to appreciate. She had observed during our childhoods that Victoria responded to awareness of resources by developing entitlement rather than gratitude. When Victoria had believed our family had limited means, she had been motivated to work hard and build her own success. Mom had feared that revealing significant family wealth would undermine that motivation and reinforce Victoria's worst tendencies toward expecting comfort without corresponding effort. For me, Mom's reasoning had been different but equally intentional. She had observed that I was naturally inclined toward creative pursuits that might not generate substantial income, and she had wanted me to develop self-sufficiency and confidence in my own capabilities rather than becoming dependent on family wealth. She had believed that knowing about her assets would have made me less likely to pursue my own path, and more likely to accept comfortable mediocrity supported by family resources. These explanations made sense to me even as I grappled with the complicated feelings they provoked. I understood Mom's logic and could even appreciate the wisdom of allowing her daughters to develop according to their own efforts, rather than being shaped by awareness of inherited wealth. However, I also felt a sense of betrayal at having been deceived for so many years. There had been times when financial stress had been significant in my life, times when knowing about Mom's resources might have alleviated considerable anxiety. The fact that she had watched me struggle while sitting on substantial wealth felt cruel even when I understood her reasons. The will itself was structured in a way that reflected Mom's nuanced understanding of both her daughters and what each of us needed. Victoria was to receive one of the rental properties outright along with $200,000 in cash from the investment accounts. This was certainly not an insignificant inheritance, but it represented only a fraction of the total estate. The remaining 3 properties, including the family home, along with the bulk of the investment accounts totaling approximately $1.5 million, were left to me. However, the distribution was not as straightforward as simply dividing assets unequally. Mom had included detailed explanations in the will document itself that outlined her reasoning and included specific provisions designed to prevent contest. She had documented Victoria's minimal involvement in her care during her final illness, contrasting it with my sustained presence and sacrifice. She had noted Victoria's financial advantages through her marriage to Robert and her high-income career, while acknowledging my more modest means and the career disruption I had accepted to provide care. Most significantly, she had included information about financial support she had provided to Victoria over the years that Victoria had never disclosed to me. According to the documents, Mom had given Victoria substantial sums during her adult life for various stated needs. There had been $50,000 for a down payment on the house Victoria and Robert had purchased, framed as a loan but never repaid. There had been $30,000 to cover debt Victoria had accumulated through overspending, given as a gift to prevent damage to her credit. There had been numerous smaller amounts for everything from funding Victoria's extravagant wedding to covering private school tuition for her children when she and Robert had experienced temporary financial difficulties. In total, Mom had provided Victoria with over $200,000 in financial assistance during the past 15 years. I had known nothing about any of this support. Victoria had never mentioned receiving help from Mom, and Mom had never spoken of providing it. The secrecy suggested that Victoria had likely portrayed these transactions to Mom as emergency situations requiring confidentiality, while simultaneously maintaining the public image of financial success and independence. The pattern revealed a level of deception and manipulation that was breathtaking in its scope and duration. The will stipulated that these previous gifts to Victoria were to be considered part of her inheritance, meaning that the current distribution was actually equalizing lifetime transfers rather than favoring me as Victoria would undoubtedly claim. Mom had meticulously documented every transaction with bank records and correspondence that established the amounts and purposes. She had also included a provision that if Victoria contested the will, she would forfeit her inheritance entirely, with her share being donated to charitable organizations Mom had supported. Reading these documents had been emotionally overwhelming. I felt validated in the sense that Mom had recognized my sacrifices and had not taken my caregiving for granted. I felt vindicated that Mom had understood Victoria's true character and had made provisions accordingly. However, I also felt burdened by the knowledge I now possessed and by the conflict I knew was coming. The will reading would expose Victoria's financial deceptions and would likely destroy whatever remained of our relationship. I would be gaining financial security while losing my sister, and the trade felt complicated rather than simply victorious. Patricia Morrison, Mom's attorney, had been practicing estate law for over 25 years, and had clearly encountered every variety of family conflict that inheritance could provoke. When I met with her privately several days before the scheduled will reading, she had provided guidance that went beyond mere legal advice. She had helped me understand the psychology of what was about to occur, and had prepared me for the various ways Victoria might respond to the revelations. Patricia explained that people who felt entitled to inheritance often reacted to disappointment with rage that could become quite volatile. Victoria would likely feel betrayed by Mom's decision, would probably deny or minimize the financial support she had received, and would almost certainly blame me for somehow manipulating Mom during her vulnerable final months. Patricia advised me to remain calm regardless of Victoria's reaction, to speak minimally during the will reading itself, and to allow the documents to carry the weight of explanation rather than attempting to defend or justify the distributions. She also explained that the no contest clause Mom had included was legally enforceable in our state, and that Victoria would be taking substantial risk if she chose to challenge the will. However, Patricia cautioned that people in emotional states often made decisions contrary to their rational self-interest, and Victoria might very well initiate a contest despite the financial consequences. If that occurred, Patricia was prepared to defend the will vigorously and was confident in its legal soundness, but the process would be stressful and potentially lengthy. During our conversation, Patricia shared observations about Mom that added depth to my understanding of the woman who had raised me. She described Mom as someone who had been far more strategic and psychologically sophisticated than most people realized. Mom had not simply accumulated wealth through financial savvy. She had thought deeply about human behavior, about how money affected relationships and character development, and about how to use resources in ways that would genuinely benefit her daughters, rather than simply providing comfort or enabling dysfunction. Patricia told me that Mom had updated her will 3 times during the past decade, each time refining the provisions as she observed her daughter's development and choices. The current version had been finalized only 8 months before her cancer diagnosis, suggesting that it represented her mature considered judgment rather than decisions made under the influence of illness or manipulation. Patricia had discussed the provisions with Mom extensively and could testify if necessary that Mom had been completely clear-minded about her intentions and had anticipated that Victoria would be unhappy with the distribution. As the day of the will reading approached, I found myself oscillating between determination to honor Mom's wishes and anxiety about the confrontation that was coming. I had never been comfortable with conflict, had always been the peacemaker who accommodated others to maintain harmony. The version of myself that was preparing to face Victoria's fury and to stand firm against her demands felt unfamiliar, as though I was trying on a persona that did not quite fit. However, I also recognized that this discomfort was precisely what growth required. Remaining in comfortable familiar patterns would mean betraying Mom's trust and allowing Victoria to manipulate me as she apparently had been manipulating our mother for years. I thought often during those days about the broader pattern of family dynamics that had created the current situation. Victoria had learned early in life that she could often get what she wanted through combinations of charm, pressure, and strategic display of emotion. Our mother had enabled this pattern to some degree by providing resources when Victoria claimed need, by smoothing over conflicts Victoria created, by maintaining family peace at the cost of consistently addressing problematic behavior. I had been complicit in the pattern as well, accepting Victoria's self-centered behavior as simply her personality rather than challenging it or setting boundaries. The result was that Victoria had reached her late 30s without ever facing meaningful consequences for manipulation or dishonesty. She had accumulated debt and received family bailouts. She had failed to reciprocate care and support when Mom needed it most. She had maintained public image of success while privately receiving substantial assistance. Now she was demanding inheritance as though she had equal moral claim to it despite having contributed far less and having already received far more than I had known about. Part of me felt sympathy for Victoria even as I prepared to oppose her demands. She had been shaped by family patterns just as I had been shaped by them. The difference was that the patterns that had shaped her had reinforced self-centered entitlement, while the patterns that had shaped me had reinforced self-sacrificing accommodation. Neither pattern was healthy, and both of us would need to change if we were to develop into fully mature adults. The will reading might serve as a catalyst for that change, forcing both of us to confront truths we had been avoiding about ourselves and our relationship. The night before the will reading, I barely slept. I reviewed the documents one final time, memorizing key details so I would not be caught off guard by anything Victoria might claim or question. I rehearsed in my mind how I would respond to various accusations or manipulative tactics she might employ. I reminded myself repeatedly of Mom's request to be strong and to trust her judgment. I tried to prepare emotionally for the possibility that this might be the end of my relationship with my sister, that after tomorrow we might never speak again beyond whatever legal communications her will contest might require. In the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I also allowed myself to feel the full weight of grief that I had been managing through practical tasks and conflict preparation. My mother was gone. The woman who had raised me, who had known me better than anyone else in the world, who had loved me despite my flaws and had believed in my potential even when I doubted myself, would never again be present for the important moments of my life. No amount of inheritance could compensate for that loss. The money represented security and opportunity, but it also represented the final communication from someone who would never speak to me again. I thought about what I would say to Mom if I could speak with her one more time. I would thank her for the sacrifices she had made to raise Victoria and me alone. I would apologize for not recognizing the full scope of those sacrifices while she was alive. I would tell her that I understood what she had been trying to teach me through the way she had structured her estate, that security without earning it would have made me weak, that struggle had built capabilities I would not have developed through comfort. I would promise to use the inheritance in ways that honored her values, and that contributed to purposes beyond my own immediate comfort. Morning arrived with a kind of bright cold sunlight that seemed inappropriate for such a fraught day. I dressed carefully in conservative professional attire that would convey seriousness without ostentation. I left my apartment 2 hours before the scheduled meeting time, needing movement and activity to manage the nervous energy that made sitting still impossible. I drove through the city with no particular destination, simply giving myself time to transition from the emotional vulnerability of private grieving to the strength I would need for the confrontation ahead. Patricia Morrison's law office was located in a restored historic building downtown, that projected exactly the kind of established respectability one would want in an estate attorney. I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in my car gathering my composure. I watched people walking past on the sidewalk going about their ordinary activities, living ordinary days without the kind of life-altering confrontation I was about to experience. I envied them their normalcy even as I recognized that everyone carried burdens invisible to casual observers, that my situation was not unique even if it felt overwhelming in the moment. Victoria's car pulled into the parking lot exactly at the scheduled meeting time. She had brought Robert with her, presumably for support or perhaps as witness to whatever injustice she anticipated discovering. I watched them walk toward the building entrance, Victoria moving with the kind of rigid posture that suggested barely contained tension. She was dressed even more formally than I was, in an expensive suit that seemed calculated to project authority and respectability. Robert walked slightly behind her, his expression suggesting he would rather be anywhere else but had been conscripted for this duty. I waited several minutes after they entered the building before following. I wanted to avoid any parking lot confrontation, and wanted to enter Patricia's office at a time of my choosing, rather than being swept in alongside Victoria. When I finally walked through the law office doors, I found Victoria and Robert already seated in the conference room visible through glass walls. Victoria was speaking intensely to Robert, gesturing in ways that suggested she was working herself up emotionally in preparation for whatever she expected to occur. Patricia greeted me in the reception area with professional warmth and quiet encouragement. She led me to the conference room where Victoria and Robert waited. The atmosphere when I entered was immediately tense. Victoria's greeting was curt, her expression a mixture of anxiety and hostility that she was making minimal effort to conceal. Robert offered a more neutral hello, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but committed to supporting his wife regardless of his personal feelings. We took seats on opposite sides of the conference table, with Patricia at the head position where she could address both parties equally. She began with standard explanations about the will reading process, emphasizing that her role was to communicate the testator's wishes as expressed in legally binding documents, not to mediate disputes or make judgments about the appropriateness of those wishes. She noted that both Victoria and I would receive copies of all relevant documents and would have opportunity to ask clarifying questions, though she would not engage with complaints about the substance of Mom's decisions. Victoria interrupted before Patricia could proceed to the actual will reading. She stated firmly that she wanted to establish her position before hearing any details. She explained that she expected equal division of all assets, regardless of what any documents might specify. She argued that she had been a devoted daughter who loved Mom deeply and deserved equal treatment. She suggested that any unequal distribution would be the result of undue influence exerted during Mom's vulnerable final months when she was not thinking clearly. She declared her intention to contest any will that did not reflect appropriate equal treatment of both daughters. The preemptive speech was clearly designed to establish moral high ground before learning what the will actually contained. Victoria was framing herself as the principled party defending fairness against anticipated injustice. She was laying groundwork for future contests by introducing the concept of undue influence before any evidence suggested such influence existed. She was attempting to control the narrative before the facts were presented. Patricia listened to Victoria's speech without visible reaction. When Victoria finished, Patricia simply stated that Mom's will would speak for itself and suggested that Victoria reserve judgment until she had heard the full contents and the reasoning Mom had provided. This measured response clearly frustrated Victoria, who had expected either agreement with her fairness argument or defensive objection that she could then use to support her grievance narrative. What happened next would forever change the dynamic between my sister and me, would expose truths that had been hidden for years, and would force both of us to confront the reality of who we had been and who we might become. The will reading was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same afterward. Patricia Morrison opened the leather portfolio containing Mom's will and supporting documents with the practiced composure of someone who had presided over countless such readings. The room fell into a silence that felt heavy with anticipation and dread. Victoria sat rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly on the table before her. Robert had positioned himself slightly back from the table, as though trying to maintain some distance from whatever was about to unfold. I focused on keeping my breathing steady and my expression neutral, Determined not to give Victoria any ammunition for later claims that I had known what was coming and had been gloating about it, Patricia began by reading the formal opening sections of the will, the standard legal language establishing Mom's identity, her sound mind at the time of execution, and the revocation of all previous wills. Victoria listened with visible impatience, clearly waiting for the substantive portions about asset distribution. When Patricia finally reached those sections, she did not rush but instead read with deliberate clarity, ensuring that every word was heard and understood. The first bequest was to Victoria. Mom left her the rental property located on Maple Street in the neighboring town of Riverside, a 3-unit building that generated approximately $30,000 annually in rental income. Additionally, Victoria was to receive $200,000 in cash from the investment accounts. Patricia read these provisions without commentary, then paused to allow them to be absorbed before continuing. Victoria's expression had shifted from tense anticipation to confused calculation. She was clearly trying to assess whether this bequest was fair or whether she should be outraged. $200,000 plus a rental property was certainly not insignificant, but it was also clearly not half of a substantial estate. Before she could formulate a response, Patricia continued reading. The next sections detailed the remainder of the estate distribution. I was to receive the family home where we had grown up, along with 2 other rental properties that Mom owned in appreciating neighborhoods. I was also to receive the bulk of the investment accounts, totaling approximately $1.5 million after Victoria's cash bequest was subtracted. The total value of my inheritance was roughly 4 times what Victoria was receiving, a disparity so significant that it could not be explained away as minor adjustment for caregiving contribution. Victoria's face went through a remarkable transformation as Patricia read these provisions. Initial confusion gave way to shock, then to a flush of anger that colored her cheeks and neck. Her mouth opened as though to interrupt, but Patricia held up a hand indicating she was not finished and that questions would be addressed after the full reading was complete. Victoria closed her mouth, but her breathing had become audibly rapid and her hands had formed into fists on the table. Patricia then began reading the most critical section of the will, the portion where Mom explained her reasoning for the unequal distribution. This section was extensive and detailed, written in Mom's own voice with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that had characterized our final conversations. Mom began by stating that she loved both her daughters equally, but that love did not require identical treatment, especially when circumstances and needs differed substantially. She explained that Victoria had received significant financial support during her adult life, support that Victoria had never disclosed to her sister. Mom then detailed each instance of this support with dates and amounts: the $50,000 down payment assistance for Victoria's house purchase, the $30,000 to pay off credit card debt that Victoria had accumulated through overspending on luxury items and maintaining a lifestyle beyond her means, the $20,000 for Victoria's wedding, which had featured expensive venue and designer dress that Victoria had insisted were necessary for her social standing, the $15,000 for private school tuition when Victoria and Robert had experienced temporary financial difficulties, numerous smaller amounts for various stated emergencies and needs. Patricia read each transaction methodically, including the documentary evidence Mom had maintained, bank transfers, canceled checks, email correspondence where Victoria had requested help and had promised the assistance would remain confidential. The total came to $235,000 over 15 years, an average of over $15,000 annually in undocumented financial support. Victoria's face had gone from flushed to pale. She was shaking her head slowly as though she could deny the facts being presented, but the documentary evidence was undeniable. Robert had turned to look at his wife with an expression that suggested this information was news to him as well. The financial support Mom had provided had apparently been concealed not only from me, but also from Victoria's husband, a deception that had implications for their marital finances and trust. Mom's explanation continued. She noted that she had provided this support because Victoria had claimed need, and because a mother's instinct was to help her children when they struggled. However, she had come to understand that the support had not been used to address genuine emergencies, but rather to enable a lifestyle that Victoria and Robert could not actually afford on their own incomes. She had realized that continuing to provide support was enabling dysfunction, rather than helping Victoria develop financial responsibility, and live within her actual means. The will stated explicitly that the current bequest to Victoria was structured to account for the substantial support already provided. When lifetime transfers were considered, the distribution between the two daughters was actually quite close to equal. Victoria was receiving less in the will precisely because she had already received more during Mom's life. This was not favoritism toward me but rather an accounting of total family resources transferred to each daughter. Patricia paused after reading this section to let its implications sink in. The silence in the room was profound. Victoria appeared to be in a state of shock, unable to formulate immediate response to having her financial deceptions exposed so thoroughly. Robert's expression had shifted to something that might have been embarrassment or perhaps anger at having been deceived by his wife about their financial situation for years. However, Mom was not finished with her explanations. Patricia continued reading, moving to a section that addressed Victoria's minimal involvement in Mom's care during her final illness. Mom documented with painful precision the disparity between her daughter's presence and support during the most difficult period of her life. She noted that I had taken leave from employment to provide full-time care, sacrificing income and career progression to ensure she was not alone during her final months. She contrasted this with Victoria's 2 brief visits, her excuses about work commitments, her absence during the final days and hours. Mom made clear that she did not expect both daughters to provide identical care, given different life circumstances. However, she also stated that Victoria's absence had been a choice reflecting her priorities and values. Victoria had chosen career advancement and social obligations over being present for her dying mother. That choice had consequences, and one of those consequences was that Mom had structured her estate to benefit the daughter who had actually been there when it mattered most. The most devastating section came next. Mom addressed the claim Victoria would likely make that I had exercised undue influence during her vulnerable final months. She stated explicitly that her will had been drafted and executed 8 months before her cancer diagnosis, when she was in perfect health and full possession of all her mental faculties. She noted that she had discussed the provisions extensively with Patricia Morrison and had been advised of the legal requirements for executing a valid will. She affirmed that her decisions were made freely, with complete understanding of their implications, and with anticipation that Victoria would be unhappy with the outcome. Mom then addressed the no contest clause directly. She explained that she had included this provision not out of vindictiveness but out of practicality. She knew Victoria's temperament and knew that disappointment would likely lead to legal challenge. However, Mom wanted her wishes honored rather than having her estate consumed by litigation fees. The no contest clause meant that if Victoria challenged the will and lost, she would forfeit her inheritance entirely, with her share being donated to the 3 charitable organizations Mom had supported throughout her adult life. The risks of contest were substantial and the likelihood of success was minimal given the careful documentation and legal validity of the will. The final section of Mom's explanation was addressed to both daughters but felt particularly directed at me. She wrote about her hopes for what the inheritance might enable each of us to do with our lives. She hoped that Victoria would use her inheritance to establish genuine financial security, rather than funding appearances and status seeking. She hoped that I would use mine to pursue creative work and meaningful contribution, without the constant financial stress that had limited my choices. She expressed her wish that both daughters would honor her memory not through maintaining perfect relationship with each other, but through living lives of integrity and purpose. When Patricia finished reading the will and Mom's explanations, she set down the documents and looked at both Victoria and me with professional neutrality. She explained that we would each receive complete copies of all documents including the supporting financial records. She noted that Victoria had 30 days to decide whether to accept the bequest as structured or to contest the will, but that contest would trigger the no contest clause with its attendant risks. She offered to answer any questions about the legal provisions, but made clear that she would not debate the fairness or wisdom of Mom's decisions. Victoria found her voice, though it came out strained and higher pitched than her normal tone. She demanded to know who had put these ideas into Mom's head, who had convinced her to write such hateful things about her own daughter, who had manipulated a dying woman into cutting her child out of her rightful inheritance. The words tumbled out rapidly, accusations and denials mixing together in a stream of defensive rage. Patricia responded with calm firmness. She explained that she had known Mom for 20 years, and had witnessed the execution of 3 different versions of her will over the past decade. The current version had been created when Mom was healthy, had been reviewed and revised multiple times over several months, and represented Mom's considered judgment. Patricia stated that she would testify under oath if necessary that Mom had been completely clear-minded and had not been subject to any influence except her own observations about her daughter's characters and choices. Victoria turned to me with an expression of pure fury. She accused me of poisoning Mom against her, of lying about her to secure greater inheritance, of taking advantage of Mom's illness to manipulate her into these provisions. She declared that she would contest the will regardless of the consequences, because she would not allow such injustice to stand unchallenged. She threatened to expose me publicly as a manipulative opportunist who had exploited our mother's death for financial gain. I had been preparing for this moment throughout the week leading up to the will reading, but the actual experience of being the target of Victoria's rage was still difficult to endure. My instinct was to defend myself, to argue against her false accusations, to try to make her understand that I had not orchestrated any of this. However, I remembered Patricia's advice to remain calm and let the documents speak for themselves. I took a breath and responded with a steadiness that surprised me. I told Victoria that Mom had made her own decisions based on her own observations, and that those decisions were documented in legally binding form. I said that I understood she was upset but that her anger was misdirected. If she had problems with how Mom had chosen to structure her estate, those problems were with Mom's judgment, not with anything I had done. I noted that I had been as surprised as anyone by the extent of Mom's assets, and by the revelations about financial support Victoria had received. I finished by saying that Victoria needed to decide whether accepting $200,000 plus a rental property was preferable to risking everything through a contest she was unlikely to win. This measured response seemed to enrage Victoria further. She stood abruptly from her chair, declaring that she was done with this farce and that I would be hearing from her attorneys. She looked at Robert and commanded that they leave immediately. Robert stood as well, his expression suggesting he was wrestling with his own complicated reactions to everything he had learned. They walked toward the conference room door, but Victoria turned back before exiting to deliver a final salvo. She told me that I had destroyed our family, that I would live with the guilt of what I had done, and that she would never forgive me for turning Mom against her and stealing what should have been shared equally. She said that whatever relationship we had once had was now permanently over, and that I was dead to her from this moment forward. Then she swept out of the conference room with Robert following behind her, leaving me alone with Patricia in the wake of her dramatic exit. The silence after Victoria's departure was almost startling in its contrast to the intensity of the previous confrontation. I felt emotionally drained but also strangely calm. I had survived the encounter I had been dreading. I had not crumbled under Victoria's accusations or been manipulated into making concessions against Mom's wishes. I had maintained composure and had spoken truth with a firmness I had not known I possessed. Patricia gave me a moment to collect myself before speaking. She told me that I had handled the situation well and that Victoria's reaction, while intense, was not unexpected given her personality and the magnitude of disappointment she had experienced. Patricia explained that Victoria would likely consult with attorneys who would review the will and supporting documentation. Those attorneys would almost certainly advise her that contest was not in her interest given the no contest clause, the strength of Mom's documentation, and the clear evidence that the will had been executed properly. However, Patricia cautioned that people in emotional states sometimes ignored sound legal advice, and we should prepare for the possibility that Victoria would proceed with contest despite the risks. We spent the next 30 minutes reviewing practical next steps. Patricia would send formal copies of all documents to both Victoria and me within the week. She would begin the probate process that would transfer assets according to the will's provisions. If Victoria initiated a contest within the 30-day window, that process would be paused while the challenge was resolved. Patricia estimated that if Victoria did not contest, the estate could be fully settled within 4 to 6 months. If she did contest, the timeline could stretch to a year or more depending on how aggressively she chose to litigate. Patricia also provided guidance about practical matters I would need to address. The rental properties would continue generating income that would need to be managed. The family home would need to be maintained even if I chose not to live there immediately. The investment accounts would require decisions about whether to maintain current allocations or adjust them according to my own risk tolerance and goals. These were new responsibilities that I would need to learn to handle, and Patricia recommended working with a financial advisor who could help me understand my options and make informed decisions. As I prepared to leave Patricia's office, she made an observation that would stay with me long after the immediate crisis passed. She said that inheritance often revealed truth about family relationships that had been obscured by polite fictions and comfortable assumptions. The money itself was secondary to the revelations about character, values, and the nature of bonds between people. Some families were strengthened by going through estate settlement because the process required honesty and mutual respect. Other families were destroyed because they had been held together only by illusions that could not survive contact with reality. She said she could not predict which outcome would ultimately prevail in my case, but that I should be prepared for the possibility that my relationship with Victoria might never recover. I drove away from Patricia's office in a state of emotional complexity that was difficult to articulate. I felt grief over the loss of my relationship with Victoria, even though I recognized that relationship had perhaps never been as genuine as I had wanted to believe. I felt relief that the confrontation was over, and that I had not compromised Mom's wishes under pressure. I felt anxiety about the uncertain period ahead, not knowing whether Victoria would contest, and what that process might entail. I felt gratitude for Mom's planning and for the security her estate would provide. Most of all, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as though a burden I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The week following the will reading brought a sequence of communications from Victoria that revealed her evolution through various stages of processing what had occurred. The first messages were angry and accusatory, reiterating her belief that I had manipulated Mom, and that she would fight the will with everything she had. These gave way to messages that attempted emotional manipulation, reminiscing about our childhood and questioning how I could allow money to destroy our bond as sisters. When these approaches failed to move me, the messages shifted to threats about public exposure and legal consequences I would face for elder abuse and undue influence. I did not respond to any of these messages. Patricia had advised me that any communication I provided could potentially be used in contest proceedings, and that the best strategy was to let the legal process unfold without engaging in emotional back and forth. The silence was difficult to maintain because my instinct was to defend myself and to try to make Victoria understand. However, I was learning that some people could not or would not understand perspectives that contradicted their preferred narratives, and that attempting to convince them was futile. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received a formal letter from an attorney Victoria had retained to explore contest options. The letter requested additional documentation about Mom's medical condition during the months before her death, suggesting they were pursuing an argument that she had lacked capacity despite the will being executed before her illness. The letter also made vague allegations about my having isolated Mom from family and having controlled her communications, creating an environment where undue influence could be exercised. Patricia responded to this letter with comprehensive documentation including medical records establishing Mom's complete mental capacity, testimony from Mom's physician about her clear-mindedness, and communication logs showing that Victoria had been invited repeatedly to participate in Mom's care but had declined. Patricia's response made clear that any contest would be vigorously defended, and that Victoria's attorneys should carefully review the no contest clause before advising their client to proceed. The effect of Patricia's response was apparently significant. Within a week, Victoria's attorney sent a brief communication indicating that after reviewing all available documentation, they had advised their client that contest was not recommended given the strength of the will and the financial risks posed by the no contest clause. The letter did not indicate whether Victoria had accepted this advice, but the 30-day contest period was approaching its end without any formal challenge being filed. On the final day of the contest period, I waited anxiously for any indication that Victoria had decided to proceed despite her attorney's advice. The day passed slowly, each hour bringing me closer to the certainty that Mom's wishes would be honored. When the court closed that evening without any contest filing, I felt relief wash over me that was almost physical in its intensity. The will would stand. The estate would be distributed as Mom had intended. The uncertainty was finally resolved. The following weeks brought the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I needed to learn to think of myself as someone with financial security rather than someone living paycheck to paycheck. I met with the financial advisor Patricia had recommended and began understanding the scope of what I had inherited. The investment accounts were structured conservatively, but had the potential to generate income that would support me indefinitely if managed prudently. The rental properties provided steady cash flow, while also appreciating in value over time. The family home represented both emotional connection to my past and practical asset that could be sold or rented if I chose not to live there. These resources created possibilities I had never seriously considered before. I could pursue creative work without constant anxiety about paying bills. I could invest time in meaningful projects that might not generate immediate income. I could contribute to causes I cared about. I could build the life Mom had hoped I would create when she planned her estate with such care and foresight. However, the price of this security was the loss of my relationship with Victoria. She had made good on her threat to cut off contact completely. She blocked my phone number and email address. She removed me from social media connections. She informed extended family members that I had betrayed her, and that they would need to choose between maintaining relationships with her or with me. Most chose her, either because they believed her version of events or because maintaining relationship with her was simply easier than trying to navigate the complicated truth. This isolation was painful in ways I had not fully anticipated. I found myself grieving not just for Mom but for the family I had thought I was part of, for the sister I had wanted Victoria to be, for the support system I had assumed would exist during difficult times. I was learning that financial security could not replace human connection, and that wealth could not fill the emptiness created by estrangement from family. Yet even in the midst of this grief and isolation, I was discovering something important about myself. I was learning that I had strength I had not known I possessed. I had stood firm against pressure and manipulation. I had honored commitments even when doing so was difficult. I had trusted in the wisdom of someone who had loved me, and had believed in my capacity to handle what she was leaving me. I was becoming the person Mom had hoped I could be. Not through sudden transformation but through making difficult choices and living with their consequences. The inheritance was not just money and property. It was a final gift from a mother who had understood her daughter's potential better than that daughter had understood herself. It was a vote of confidence that I was capable of more than I had been demonstrating. It was a challenge to live with courage and integrity rather than with comfortable accommodation. Most fundamentally, it was an opportunity to discover who I could become when I stopped limiting myself according to others' expectations and started pursuing the life I genuinely wanted. The journey ahead would require continuing to develop strength and resilience. There would be moments of doubt when I questioned whether I had made the right choices. There would be times when I missed my sister and wondered if the inheritance was worth the cost of that relationship. There would be challenges in learning to manage resources I had never expected to possess. However, I was no longer the person who had stood frozen in grief at her mother's funeral while her sister made demands. I was becoming someone who could face difficulty with determination, who could honor commitments despite pressure, and who could build a life of purpose rather than simply existing in comfortable limitation. This transformation was just beginning. The weeks following the resolution of the estate settlement brought a strange mixture of relief and disorientation. The constant tension and anxiety that had characterized the period between Mom's death and the end of the contest window had finally dissipated. But in its place came a kind of purposeless quiet that was almost more difficult to navigate. I had been so focused on managing the immediate crisis, on standing firm against Victoria's demands, on honoring Mom's wishes, that I had not thought carefully about what would come after. Now that the battle was over, I found myself facing the question of what to do with the life and resources I had been given. The financial advisor Patricia had recommended, a woman named Jennifer Chan who specialized in working with inheritance beneficiaries, had become an unexpected source of guidance during this transition period. Our initial meeting had been focused on practical matters like investment strategy, tax implications, and estate administration logistics. However, as Jennifer learned more about my circumstances and my emotional state, she had begun addressing questions that went beyond mere financial management. Jennifer explained that many people who received substantial inheritances went through a psychological adjustment period that could be surprisingly challenging. The sudden shift from financial constraint to financial security disrupted established patterns of thinking and decision-making. People who had made choices based on economic necessity suddenly found themselves with freedom to choose based on preference and values, and that freedom could be paralyzing for those unaccustomed to it. Additionally, inheritances often came with complicated emotions around the person who had died and the circumstances that had made the inheritance possible. In my case, these psychological challenges were compounded by the family conflict and estrangement that had resulted from the estate settlement. I was processing grief over Mom's death, loss of my relationship with Victoria, and the revelation of truths about my family that had fundamentally altered my understanding of my own history. The inheritance represented security and opportunity, but it was inextricably linked with loss and pain that made it difficult to embrace without reservation. Jennifer suggested that before making any major financial decisions or life changes, I should spend time clarifying what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I should want, or what would make the inheritance feel justified. She recommended exercises in values clarification and goal setting that would help me understand my own priorities, rather than simply reacting to circumstances. She emphasized that the inheritance gave me freedom to design a life aligned with my authentic preferences, but that freedom was valuable only if I actually knew what those preferences were. This guidance led me to spend considerable time in reflection and journaling, exploring questions I had not seriously considered before. What did I want my life to look like 5 years from now? What kinds of work or activities created genuine satisfaction rather than just paying bills? What contributions did I want to make that would give my life meaning beyond personal comfort? What relationships did I want to cultivate now that I understood more clearly which connections had been genuine and which had been based on obligation or habit? The answers that emerged from this reflection process were sometimes surprising. I had assumed that financial security would primarily mean relief from stress and anxiety, and while that was certainly part of it, I discovered that what I actually wanted was not just freedom from constraint but freedom toward purpose. I did not want to simply stop worrying about money. I wanted to use the security the inheritance provided as foundation for building life that mattered, that contributed something valuable, that reflected the values Mom had tried to instill in me through her own example of hard work and quiet generosity. One clear realization was that I wanted to return to the creative work I had trained for, but had largely abandoned due to economic pressures. I had studied graphic design and visual communication, but my actual career had devolved into formulaic production work that paid bills without engaging my creative abilities or interests. The inheritance meant I could afford to take risks on projects that mattered to me, even if they did not generate immediate income. I could spend time developing skills and portfolio pieces that would position me for more meaningful work. I could be selective about clients and projects rather than accepting whatever paid. Another insight was that I wanted to honor Mom's memory through the kind of quiet generosity she had practiced throughout her life. The charitable organizations Mom had supported in her will represented causes she had cared about deeply. Educational access for disadvantaged youth, support services for single parents, and healthcare access for underserved communities. I wanted to continue supporting these causes not just through financial donations, but through active involvement that would deepen my understanding of the challenges they addressed. A third realization was that I wanted to rebuild my social connections and community in more intentional ways. The estrangement from Victoria had revealed how much of my social life had been centered around family relationships that had not been as healthy or genuine as I had believed. I needed to develop friendships and connections based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than on family obligation or comfortable habit. This would require vulnerability and effort, putting myself in situations where I might meet people with similar interests and values, investing time in building relationships that had potential to become meaningful. The family home where I had grown up had become a particular focus of decision-making during this period. The house held decades of memories, both comforting and painful. It represented stability and connection to my past, but it also carried associations with the family dynamics that had shaped me in ways I was still working to understand and move beyond. The practical question was whether to keep the house and live in it, keep it and rent it out, or sell it and fully separate from that tangible connection to my childhood. I spent several afternoons walking through the empty rooms of the house, remembering different periods of my life and different versions of myself who had inhabited those spaces. The kitchen where Mom had prepared countless meals while juggling multiple jobs and exhausting schedules. The living room where Victoria and I had played as children before our personalities and priorities had diverged so dramatically. My childhood bedroom where I had dreamed about futures that had seemed impossibly distant. Mom's bedroom where I had sat with her during her final months, listening to her stories and trying to absorb lessons she was desperate to communicate before time ran out. The house was filled with echoes of the past, and I needed to decide whether those echoes would be comforting reminders or painful constraints preventing me from moving forward. After considerable reflection, I decided to keep the house but not to live in it immediately. I would renovate and update it thoughtfully, honoring its history while making it suitable for my adult life, rather than just preserving it as a shrine to the past. When the renovations were complete, I would decide whether to make it my primary residence or whether to rent it to a family who would create new memories within its walls. The 2 rental properties Mom had left me were generating steady income that covered their expenses and contributed to my financial security. I visited each property and met with the tenants, wanting to understand these assets as more than just line items on financial statements. The properties were well maintained and the tenants were respectful people who took pride in their homes. Managing these properties would require attention and occasional difficult decisions, but they also represented the kind of careful stewardship Mom had practiced throughout her life, building assets that provided value to others while also generating returns. As I began making these practical decisions about properties and investments, I was also starting to engage more actively with the creative work I had identified as central to the life I wanted to build. I set up a home studio space in my apartment with professional equipment I had always wanted, but had never been able to justify purchasing. I began working on personal design projects that reflected my actual aesthetic interests, rather than client preferences. I started building portfolio pieces that showcased capabilities I had not been able to demonstrate through commercial work. This creative work was deeply satisfying in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. When I lost myself in the design process, hours would pass without my awareness. I experienced flow states where my skills were fully engaged in service of meaningful challenges. I created work I was genuinely proud of rather than just adequate productions that met minimum requirements. The financial security from the inheritance meant I could focus on quality and meaning rather than on speed and volume. However, this period of exploration and rebuilding was not without difficult moments. There were days when I felt overwhelmed by grief for Mom, and by the loss of the family structure I had taken for granted. There were times when I questioned whether I had made the right choices during the estate settlement, wondering if I should have simply agreed to Victoria's demands to preserve family peace. There were moments when the freedom and opportunity the inheritance provided felt more like burden than gift, weight of responsibility to use resources wisely, rather than squandering them on trivial pursuits. During one particularly difficult evening about 3 months after the estate settlement, I found myself looking through photographs from throughout my life. Baby pictures where Mom looked young and energetic, full of hope about the future she would build for her daughters. Childhood photos showing Victoria and me playing together before our relationship had been complicated by jealousy and competition. Teenage years when I had been so focused on fitting in and avoiding conflict that I had not developed strong sense of my own identity or preferences. Recent photos from Mom's final months where the toll of illness was visible, but so was the love and connection between us. Looking at these images, I felt profound gratitude for the life Mom had given me, and for the final gift she had provided through her carefully planned estate. I also felt sadness for the relationships that had been lost, or had proven less genuine than I had believed. Most of all, I felt determination to honor Mom's investment in me by building life that reflected the values she had tried to teach, and that contributed something meaningful beyond my own comfort and security. This determination led me to reach out to one of the charitable organizations Mom had supported, an educational nonprofit that provided tutoring and mentorship for students from low-income families. I contacted the executive director and explained that I had inherited resources from my mother, who had been a long-time donor, and that I wanted to become more actively involved beyond just financial contributions. I offered my graphic design skills for any marketing or communications needs they might have, and I expressed interest in potentially serving as a mentor if they had need for someone with my background. The response was enthusiastic and immediate. The organization was always in need of pro bono professional services, and they were actively recruiting mentors for their high school program. Within 2 weeks, I had my first meeting with a 15-year-old student named Maya who was interested in visual arts, but had limited exposure to design principles or professional pathways. I had also begun working on a redesign of the organization's website and marketing materials that would better communicate their impact and attract additional support. The mentoring relationship with Maya proved to be surprisingly meaningful for both of us. She reminded me of a younger version of myself, talented and curious but unsure whether creative pursuits were practical, or whether she should focus on more conventional paths to economic security. I shared my own journey, including the years I had spent in unfulfilling work, because I had not believed I could support myself through creative expression. I encouraged her to develop her skills while also being realistic about the business aspects of creative careers. I introduced her to design tools and techniques, helped her build beginning portfolio pieces, and connected her with resources for continuing her education. Through this mentoring work, I began to understand something important about the purpose the inheritance could serve. The financial security it provided was valuable not primarily because it allowed me to live comfortably, but because it gave me capacity to contribute to others without being consumed by my own economic anxieties. I could invest time in helping Maya without worrying about billable hours. I could do pro bono work for the nonprofit without stress about how I would cover my expenses. I could make decisions based on what would be most valuable rather than on what would be most profitable. This insight helped me reframe my relationship with the inheritance. It was not primarily about what I had gained but about what I could now give. Mom had worked hard throughout her life to build resources that she could not fully enjoy herself, because she was always focused on securing her daughter's futures. The inheritance was her final act of generosity, not just providing money but providing freedom to live according to values rather than according to necessities. Honoring that gift meant using the freedom wisely, in service of purposes beyond my own immediate comfort. As the 6-month mark after Mom's death approached, I found myself taking stock of how much had changed during that intense period. I had lost my mother, who had been the most important person in my life. I had lost my relationship with my sister, which had proven to be more fraught and conditional than I had wanted to believe. I had lost the comfortable ignorance that had allowed me to avoid confronting difficult truths about my family dynamics and my own patterns of accommodating dysfunction. However, I had also gained clarity about what mattered to me and what kind of life I wanted to build. I had developed strength and conviction I had not known I possessed. Standing firm against pressure and manipulation when doing so required courage, I had to discover within myself. I had received resources that provided security and freedom, not as reward for having suffered, but as tool for building something meaningful. I had begun connecting with new communities and relationships based on shared values, rather than on family obligation or circumstantial proximity. The grief remained, and I suspected it would remain for a long time, perhaps forever in some form. I missed Mom constantly and found myself wanting to tell her about developments in my life, only to remember that she was gone, and those conversations were no longer possible. The estrangement from Victoria created ongoing sadness that was complicated by anger, regret, and acknowledgement that the relationship had never been as healthy as I had wanted it to be. Yet alongside the grief and loss, there was also growth and possibility. I was becoming someone different from who I had been before Mom's death, someone more honest with herself and others, someone more willing to face difficulty rather than avoiding it through accommodation, someone more intentional about how she lived rather than simply following paths of least resistance. This transformation was not complete, and there would be setbacks and struggles ahead. However, the direction was clear, and the foundation had been established. Jennifer Chun had mentioned during one of our meetings that the first year after receiving a substantial inheritance was typically the most difficult psychologically. The adjustment to new financial reality combined with grief and family dynamics created unique challenges that many people underestimated. However, she had also observed that people who navigated this first year thoughtfully, who took time to clarify values and make intentional choices rather than reactive ones, often emerged with stronger sense of purpose and direction than they had possessed before the inheritance. I was beginning to understand what she meant. The inheritance was forcing me to confront questions about meaning and purpose that I might have indefinitely postponed if I had remained in comfortable routine of working to pay bills and following familiar patterns. The loss of Mom and the estrangement from Victoria had stripped away comfortable illusions about family relationships and had forced me to develop more authentic connections based on genuine mutual respect. The freedom from economic constraint was revealing what I actually cared about beyond mere survival and security. These insights were not purely positive in their implications. They revealed how much of my previous life had been spent in avoidance and accommodation, how much potential I had left undeveloped because it seemed impractical or risky. However, they also created possibilities for the future that had not existed before. I was not bound by past patterns or by others' expectations. I could design a life that reflected my authentic preferences and values. The question was whether I had the courage and discipline to actually pursue that life rather than simply imagining it. As I prepared for the 6-month commemoration of Mom's death, I decided to visit her grave alone before the small memorial gathering I had organized with a few of Mom's close friends who had remained in contact with me despite the family estrangement. I wanted time to speak with her privately, to update her on what had transpired since her death, and to thank her for the gifts she had given me, both tangible and intangible. Standing at her grave on that autumn morning, I told Mom about the will reading and Victoria's reaction. I assured her that I had stood firm as she had asked me to, that I had honored her wishes despite considerable pressure to do otherwise. I described the ways I was beginning to use the inheritance, the creative work I was pursuing, the mentoring relationship with Maya, the involvement with the charitable organization she had supported. I acknowledged the grief and loss but also the growth and possibility. Most importantly, I thanked her for believing in me, for understanding my potential better than I had understood it myself, for providing resources that gave me freedom to discover who I could become. I promised to continue working to deserve her confidence, to build a life that would make her proud, to honor her memory through how I chose to live rather than just through how I remembered her. The memorial gathering later that day was small but meaningful. The people who attended were those who had known Mom well, and had valued her for who she actually was rather than for what she could provide. They shared stories about her kindness, her quiet strength, her dedication to her daughters, even when that dedication was not equally reciprocated. Listening to these remembrances, I understood that Mom had been seen and appreciated by others in ways that Victoria and I had perhaps taken for granted because we had been too close and too focused on our own needs. As the gathering concluded and guests departed, I felt a sense of completion regarding this initial phase of grief and adjustment. I would continue missing Mom and would continue processing the complicated emotions around her death and the inheritance. However, I was ready to move forward more actively into the next phase of building the life she had given me resources and freedom to create. The journey ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, moments of doubt and moments of clarity, continued growth and occasional regression. However, I was no longer the person who had stood paralyzed at the funeral home while her sister made demands. I was becoming someone who could face difficulty with courage, who could honor commitments despite opposition, who could build a life of meaning and purpose, rather than simply existing in comfortable limitation. This transformation was still unfolding, and the story was far from complete. The inheritance had provided resources and opportunity, but it was up to me to determine what I would do with them. The choice was mine to make, and I was finally beginning to understand that I had the strength and wisdom to make it well. The months following the 6-month commemoration brought a period of relative stability that allowed me to settle into new rhythms and routines. I had established a workspace in the family home, which was undergoing gradual renovation that preserved its character while updating systems and finishes. The creative projects I had been developing were gaining traction, with several potential clients expressing interest in working with me, based on portfolio pieces I had shared. The mentoring relationship with Maya was deepening as she prepared her applications for art school programs with scholarships that might make higher education financially feasible. However, this period of stability was disrupted by an unexpected discovery that would add new dimensions to my understanding of Mom's life and the choices she had made. The discovery began innocuously enough, during a weekend when I was sorting through boxes of Mom's personal papers and belongings that had been stored in the attic of the family home. Most of what I found was exactly what one would expect: old tax returns, insurance policies, receipts for major purchases, photographs from throughout her life. However, tucked into a box that appeared to contain random papers was a journal that Mom had kept during the years immediately following our father's death. I had not known that Mom kept journals. She had never mentioned this practice, and I had assumed that her life had been too busy and demanding for such reflective activities. The journal was worn and filled with entries written in Mom's distinctive handwriting, spanning roughly 3 years from when I was 8 years old until I was 11. I hesitated before beginning to read, uncertain whether these private thoughts were meant to be discovered or whether I was violating some boundary by reading them even after her death. Ultimately, curiosity and the desire to understand Mom more fully overcame my hesitation. I settled into a chair in the attic and began reading the entries chronologically. What I discovered in those pages would fundamentally alter my understanding of the sacrifices Mom had made and the challenges she had navigated during what I had always assumed was simply a difficult period of single parenthood. The early entries documented Mom's overwhelming grief following Dad's sudden death from a heart attack. She had been 33 years old with 2 young daughters, limited savings, and uncertain prospects for supporting her family. The entries revealed her fear and desperation in ways she had never shown her daughters, her nights of crying after Victoria and I were asleep, her terror about whether she could keep us housed and fed, her anger at being left alone to manage everything. However, the entries also revealed something I had not known. In the months following Dad's death, Mom had received a settlement from his life insurance policy that had been substantially larger than I had realized. The amount was not enormous by the standards of wealth, but it was sufficient to have provided several years of financial stability, while she established herself professionally or pursued education that might have led to better career opportunities. Instead, Mom had made a different choice with the money, one that the journal documented in painful detail. Mom's younger brother, my Uncle Richard, had approached her several months after Dad's death with a business proposition. Richard had always been the charming but financially irresponsible member of Mom's family, full of grand ideas and ambitious plans that never quite materialized into success. He had told Mom that he had an opportunity to invest in a restaurant venture with friends who had experience in the hospitality industry. He needed capital to secure his partnership stake, and he promised that the restaurant would be successful and would provide steady returns that would help Mom support her daughters. The journal entries showed Mom's internal struggle over this decision. She had doubts about Richard's business judgment and reliability. She had concerns about risking money that represented her daughter's security. However, she also felt family obligation and wanted to believe in her brother's promises. Richard had been there for her during the immediate aftermath of Dad's death, helping with practical tasks and providing emotional support. She wanted to reciprocate that support and wanted to believe that the restaurant investment was the solid opportunity he claimed it to be. Against her better judgment, Mom had invested $75,000 of the life insurance settlement into Richard's restaurant venture. The journal entries over the following months documented the slow realization that she had made a terrible mistake. The restaurant struggled from the beginning due to poor location choice, inadequate marketing, and management conflicts among the partners. Within 18 months, the business had failed completely, and Mom's entire investment was lost. The entries during this period were heartbreaking to read. Mom blamed herself for having been foolish and naive. She grieved the loss of security she could have provided for her daughters. She was furious with Richard for having convinced her to risk money she could not afford to lose. Most painfully, she documented her decision not to tell anyone what had happened, choosing instead to work multiple jobs to compensate for the lost financial cushion, rather than admitting the mistake or asking family members for help. This revelation explains so much about the childhood I remembered. Mom had indeed been working constantly and had seemed perpetually exhausted, but I had assumed this was simply the natural consequence of single parenthood with limited resources. I had not known that she was working so hard partly to compensate for a catastrophic financial loss that had been caused by misplaced trust in family. The modest lifestyle we had lived, which I had accepted as normal, had been the result of Mom rebuilding from a setback that had consumed resources that should have provided years of breathing room. The journal entries showed Mom processing not just the financial loss but the betrayal of trust. Richard had become defensive when the restaurant failed, blaming external factors and suggesting that Mom should not have expected guaranteed returns on a business investment. He had never acknowledged responsibility for having pushed her to invest money she could not afford to lose in a venture that he had misrepresented as being safer than it actually was. The relationship between Mom and Richard had become strained after this incident, and the journal revealed that this strain was not just about money, but about broken trust and failed family loyalty. Reading these entries, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at Uncle Richard for having taken advantage of Mom's vulnerability, and family loyalty. Sadness that Mom had carried this burden alone rather than sharing it with anyone who might have provided support. admiration for her resilience in rebuilding from such a devastating setback without allowing it to crush her spirit or diminish her commitment to raising her daughters well. Grief that she had never told me this story while she was alive, perhaps because she had been ashamed of the mistake or perhaps because she had not wanted to burden me with knowledge of family dysfunction. However, there was more to discover in the journal entries. As Mom had worked to recover from the financial loss, she had also been educating herself about money management and investment principles. She had read books about personal finance, had consulted with a financial advisor, and had developed a strategy for building wealth systematically through careful savings and conservative investments. The journal documented her commitment to never again allow family obligation or emotional appeals to override sound financial judgment. This commitment explained the careful, methodical approach to wealth building that had eventually resulted in the estate she left behind. Every rental property purchase was documented with detailed analysis of the investment thesis and potential returns. Every investment account contribution was noted with reflections on the importance of consistency and patience. Mom had transformed the painful lesson from the restaurant investment into discipline that had served her well over subsequent decades. The journal entries also revealed Mom's thinking about her daughters and the different paths our lives seemed to be taking. She worried about Victoria's tendency toward materialism and status-seeking, recognizing echoes of Uncle Richard's charm and financial irresponsibility. She hoped that I would develop stronger sense of self-worth and would not allow others to take advantage of my accommodating nature. She reflected on the challenge of trying to shape her daughters' characters while also respecting their autonomy and allowing them to learn from their own experiences. Reading these parental observations was both comforting and unsettling. It was comforting to see evidence that Mom had understood both Victoria and me quite clearly, that her decisions about the estate distribution had been based on years of observation rather than on manipulation during her final months. It was unsettling to recognize how early the patterns that would define our adult relationship had been visible, and to wonder whether things might have been different if Mom had intervened more forcefully to address those patterns rather than hoping we would outgrow them. The final entries in the journal, written when I was about 11 years old, showed Mom beginning to see some light after the years of struggle following the restaurant investment loss. She had paid off debts, had rebuilt savings, and had begun to believe that she might be able to provide more stability and opportunity for her daughters. The entries expressed hope about the future and determination to continue the disciplined approach to finances that was starting to generate results. The journal ended without explanation, presumably because Mom had either stopped journaling or had kept subsequent journals that were stored elsewhere or had been discarded. I spent the entire day in the attic reading and rereading the journal entries, trying to absorb their implications and integrate this new information into my understanding of Mom's life. The discovery reframed so much of what I thought I had known. Mom's frugality had not just been natural temperament or wise choice, but had been forged through painful experience with financial loss. Her emotional distance from her brother's family, which I had noticed but never questioned, had not been arbitrary but had been the result of betrayed trust. Her careful planning around the estate distribution had not been recent development, but had been the culmination of decades of reflection on family dynamics and money's role in relationships. The discovery also raised questions about whether I should share this information with Victoria. The journal entries documented family history that was not just Mom's private experience, but was part of our shared heritage. Victoria had a right to know about the restaurant investment and Uncle Richard's role in it. However, sharing the information would likely trigger another round of conflict, and would require reopening communications that Victoria had decisively closed after the estate settlement. I was uncertain whether the value of Victoria knowing this history justified the cost of engaging with her again. I decided to consult with Jennifer Chun about how to think through this dilemma. During our next meeting, I shared the discovery of the journal and asked for her perspective on whether and how to share the information with Victoria. Jennifer listened carefully and then offered observations that helped clarify my thinking. She explained that financial inheritances often came with informational inheritances as well, discoveries about family history that added context to financial decisions and relationships. These discoveries could be valuable for understanding family patterns and one's own relationship with money. However, they could also be weaponized in family conflicts, with different parties interpreting the same information in ways that reinforce their existing grievances rather than promoting understanding. Jennifer suggested that I consider several questions before deciding whether to share the journal with Victoria. First, what was my motivation for sharing? Was it genuine belief that Victoria would benefit from the information, or was it desire to justify Mom's estate decisions by revealing additional context? Second, what was the likely outcome of sharing? Would Victoria actually absorb and reflect on the information, or would she find ways to dismiss it or use it to further her grievance narrative? Third, was I prepared for the reopening of communication and the potential conflict that sharing might trigger? These questions helped me recognize that my primary motivation for wanting to share the journal was defensive. I wanted Victoria to understand that Mom's financial choices had been shaped by painful experiences with family members who had taken advantage of her trust and generosity. I wanted Victoria to see that Mom's caution about providing unlimited financial support to her daughters had come from wisdom earned through difficult experience. Essentially, I wanted to use the journal to prove that Mom had been right to structure her estate as she had, and that Victoria's claims of unfairness were unfounded. However, Jennifer pointed out that using the journal this way would likely backfire. Victoria would almost certainly interpret the information in ways that served her existing narrative rather than challenging it. She might argue that the restaurant investment proved that Mom had poor judgment about money, and therefore the estate distribution was similarly flawed. She might use Uncle Richard's betrayal to claim that all family members except her had taken advantage of Mom, and that she was the only loyal daughter. She might accuse me of selectively revealing information that served my interests, while concealing other relevant context. After considerable reflection, I decided that the journal entries were Mom's private processing of painful experiences, and that sharing them with Victoria in our current state of estrangement would not serve any productive purpose. If Victoria and I ever reconciled and rebuilt our relationship on healthier foundations, there might be a time when sharing this family history would contribute to mutual understanding. However, attempting to use the journal to win arguments or prove points would dishonor Mom's privacy, and would likely create more conflict rather than resolution. The decision not to share the journal immediately did not resolve the emotional impact of having discovered it. The revelations about Uncle Richard's betrayal and Mom's subsequent financial journey added depth to my understanding of her character and her choices. She had not been the simple hardworking single mother I had always believed her to be. She had been a complex woman who had made mistakes, had been betrayed by family, had responded to setbacks with remarkable resilience, and had built something substantial from the ruins of loss and disappointment. This more nuanced understanding made me appreciate the inheritance even more deeply. The resources Mom had left me had not come easily or from lucky circumstances. They had been built through decades of disciplined sacrifice after a devastating financial loss that could have broken someone less determined. Every dollar in those investment accounts represented hours of work at multiple jobs. Every rental property represented careful analysis and patient saving for down payments. The inheritance was not just money, but was the physical manifestation of Mom's determination to create security despite circumstances that had conspired against it. Understanding this context made me more committed to using the inheritance wisely, and in ways that honored the effort Mom had invested in creating it. Frivolous spending or reckless investment choices would be particularly egregious betrayals of her sacrifice. The resources needed to be stewarded carefully, grown through sound management, and deployed in service of purposes that aligned with the values Mom had demonstrated through her life. The discovery of the journal also deepened my understanding of why Mom had been so careful about the estate distribution. She had learned through bitter experience that family obligation and emotional appeals could override sound judgment about money. She had seen how financial support provided to family members without clear terms could create dependency and resentment, rather than helping them build their own capabilities. She had understood that sometimes loving someone meant allowing them to experience consequences of their choices, rather than constantly providing bailouts that prevented learning. These lessons explained Mom's approach to both her daughters. Victoria had received substantial financial support during her adult life, but that support had enabled rather than helped her. When Mom planned her estate, she had recognized that leaving Victoria equal share of substantial assets would likely produce similar results, funding lifestyle and status seeking rather than building genuine security or addressing underlying problems with financial discipline. The smaller inheritance with documentation of previous support was Mom's attempt to force Victoria to confront these patterns rather than continuing to enable them. For me, Mom had recognized different challenges and needs. I had not asked for financial bailouts but had instead struggled independently, sometimes to my own detriment. The larger inheritance was not reward for caregiving, but was provision of resources that would give me freedom to develop capabilities and pursue purposes that my financial constraints had prevented. Mom had understood that I needed not just money but permission and encouragement to take risks on meaningful work, rather than limiting myself to safe but unfulfilling paths. As the 8th month after Mom's death approached, I found myself integrating these discoveries and reflections into a more complete understanding of my family history and my own identity. I was not just the daughter of a single mother who had worked hard to provide basic security. I was the daughter of a woman who had survived financial betrayal, had rebuilt from devastating loss, had developed wisdom through painful experience, and had used that wisdom to create opportunities for her daughters that she herself had never enjoyed. This understanding carried implications for how I thought about my own life and choices. I had inherited not just financial resources but also lessons about resilience, about learning from mistakes, about the importance of boundaries in family relationships, and about using resources in service of values rather than for empty status or comfort. The question was whether I would internalize and apply these lessons or whether I would squander them through failure to appreciate their significance. The mentoring relationship with Maya was providing opportunities to pass along some of these lessons, though in forms appropriate for a teenager, rather than in the complex adult context of inheritance and family dysfunction. I talked with Maya about the importance of developing financial literacy and building skills that could support her independence. I shared stories about how limited resources could sometimes be gifts that force creativity and determination. I encouraged her to think carefully about the relationship between money and values, about what kind of life she wanted to build and how financial choices either supported or undermined that vision. Maya was absorbing these lessons in ways that suggested they would shape her future choices. She was developing portfolio pieces with remarkable skill for someone her age. She was researching schools and scholarship opportunities with diligence and strategic thinking. She was building support network of teachers and mentors who could provide guidance and advocacy. Most importantly, she was developing confidence in her own capabilities and belief that she could create the future she envisioned, rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances presented. Watching Maya's growth reminded me of what Mom must have felt watching Victoria and me develop. The hope that lessons taught would be learned and applied. The worry that mistakes made might have lasting consequences. The recognition that ultimately each person must find their own path, and that parental influence, whether through teaching or through inheritance, could only create opportunities that the recipient must choose to embrace. As I reflected on these parallel journeys of development and inheritance, I understood more fully that the transformation I was experiencing was not just about me. It was part of a longer pattern of growth across generations. Mom had learned from her parents and from her own experiences. She had attempted to pass those lessons to Victoria and me through how she lived and through how she structured her estate. I was now in position to learn from Mom's example and to potentially pass along wisdom to others like Maya who were still forming their understanding of how to navigate life's challenges. This intergenerational perspective made the inheritance feel less like a windfall and more like a responsibility. I was not just a lucky beneficiary of Mom's hard work. I was a steward of resources and wisdom that had been built through generations of effort and sacrifice. The question was what I would do with this stewardship, how I would honor the past while also creating future that reflected my own values and aspirations. The journey was continuing to unfold in ways I could not have predicted when I first stood in the funeral home parking lot listening to Victoria make demands about inheritance neither of us had fully understood. I was learning that financial inheritances were inseparable from emotional and psychological inheritances, that money carried meaning that went far beyond its purchasing power, and that using resources wisely required understanding the context and history that had created them. The transformation that had begun with Mom's death and the estate settlement was revealing itself to be more complex and more profound than I had initially recognized. I was not just inheriting money and property. I was inheriting responsibility for honoring sacrifice, for learning from painful lessons, for building on foundations that had been laid through decades of effort, and for potentially passing along wisdom to others who might benefit from what I was learning. This was not the simple story of financial windfall that it might have appeared from the outside. It was a story about family, about resilience, about the complicated relationship between money and love, about learning to stand firm in the face of manipulation, and about discovering strength and purpose through navigating loss and conflict. The inheritance was a catalyst for transformation, but the actual transformation was happening within me, as I learned what it meant to honor Mom's gift by becoming the person she had believed I could be. The approaching one-year anniversary of Mom's death brought with it a heightened awareness of how profoundly my life had changed during those 12 months. The woman I had been when Mom was still alive seemed like a distant memory, someone who had existed in a state of comfortable limitation without recognizing the patterns that constrained her. The woman I was becoming had begun to understand that growth required embracing discomfort, and that security came not from avoiding challenges, but from developing capacity to navigate them effectively. The creative work I had been developing had evolved from personal exploration into a sustainable professional practice. Several clients who valued thoughtful design over quick production had engaged me for projects that allowed me to work at a pace that prioritized quality. The income from these projects, combined with the rental property revenue and conservative withdrawals from the investment accounts, provided financial stability without requiring me to compromise on the kinds of work I was willing to accept. I had learned to say no to projects that did not align with my values, or that would require sacrificing standards for the sake of timeline or budget. This professional confidence represented a significant departure from my previous pattern of accepting whatever work was offered out of fear that declining opportunities would leave me without income. The financial security from the inheritance had provided the foundation for this shift, but the actual transformation required internal work that went beyond mere economic circumstances. I had needed to develop belief in the value of my work and willingness to advocate for myself rather than accommodating clients' every demand regardless of reasonableness. The renovation of the family home had reached a stage where I was seriously considering making it my primary residence. The updates had preserved the character and memories of the house while modernizing systems and creating spaces that reflected my adult aesthetic, rather than being trapped in childhood nostalgia. The kitchen where Mom had prepared countless meals now featured professional-grade equipment that would allow me to develop culinary skills I had always wanted to explore. The living room had been opened up to create better flow and light, while maintaining the cozy atmosphere I remembered from childhood gatherings. My childhood bedroom had been transformed into a proper home office with built-in storage and workspace designed specifically for my creative work. Walking through the renovated rooms, I felt a sense of connection to Mom that was both comforting and bittersweet. She would have appreciated the care taken to honor the home's history, while also making it functional for contemporary life. She would have encouraged me to make the space truly my own, rather than preserving it as a shrine to the past. However, she would never actually see what I had created or share in the life I was building within these walls. That absence remained a constant ache that no amount of positive transformation could entirely heal. The mentoring relationship with Maya had deepened beyond my initial expectations. She had been accepted to several art schools with scholarship packages that would make attendance financially feasible, and she had sought my guidance in making the difficult choice among programs that each offered different advantages. Through helping her think through these decisions, I found myself articulating values and priorities that clarified my own thinking about what constituted meaningful work and purposeful life. Maya's questions about balancing artistic integrity with practical career considerations forced me to examine how I was navigating these same tensions in my own professional choices. Beyond the mentoring relationship, I had begun developing broader involvement with the educational nonprofit that Mom had supported. I had joined their advisory board, contributing both financial resources and professional expertise in communications and branding. The work had connected me with other professionals who shared commitment to expanding educational access, and who brought diverse perspectives on how to address systemic barriers facing underserved students. These relationships were filling the social void that had been created by estrangement from Victoria and distance from extended family, who had chosen sides in that conflict. However, this period of relative stability and positive momentum was disrupted by an unexpected communication that forced me to confront aspects of my family history I had been content to leave unexamined. The disruption came in the form of an email from Uncle Richard, the brother whose failed restaurant investment had consumed a substantial portion of Mom's life insurance settlement decades earlier. I had not heard from Richard in over 10 years, and had assumed our family connections had faded to the point of irrelevance. The email arrived without warning and immediately created anxiety about what it might contain. Richard's message began with expressions of condolence about Mom's death that felt perfunctory and obligatory, rather than genuinely felt. He acknowledged that he had not attended the funeral, explaining that he had been traveling internationally for business and had not learned of her passing until after the services had concluded. This explanation seemed dubious given that the obituary had been published and family members had been notified well in advance, but I chose not to challenge it directly. The real purpose of his communication became clear in the subsequent paragraphs. Richard explained that he had recently learned about the estate settlement and had been surprised to discover that Mom had accumulated substantial assets before her death. He expressed confusion about why she had never mentioned this wealth to family members and suggested that perhaps she had been influenced by advisors who had not had her best interests at heart. He noted that he had heard through family channels that the estate distribution had created conflict between Victoria and me, and he offered to serve as mediator who could help resolve the dispute fairly. The barely concealed subtext of Richard's message was transparent. He had learned that there was money involved and wanted to position himself to benefit from it somehow. The offer to mediate was not motivated by genuine concern for family harmony, but by desire to insert himself into the situation in ways that might create opportunities for him. The suggestion that Mom had been manipulated by advisors was clearly designed to undermine the estate structure and to create doubt about the legitimacy of her decisions. My immediate reaction was anger at Richard's presumption and at his apparent belief that I would not recognize his manipulative tactics. However, as I set aside the initial emotional response and considered the communication more carefully, I recognized that it presented an opportunity to address unfinished business and to establish boundaries that would prevent future intrusions. I also recognized that responding effectively would require understanding Richard's likely motivations and anticipating how he might escalate if his initial approach did not produce the results he desired. I consulted with Patricia Morrison about the appropriate way to respond to Richard's communication. Patricia explained that it was not uncommon for peripheral family members to emerge after estate settlements when they learned that substantial assets were involved. These individuals often position themselves as concerned family members seeking to help resolve conflicts, while actually hoping to benefit from redistributions or settlements that might occur if the original estate plan was successfully challenged, or if family members could be manipulated into sharing resources out of guilt or obligation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.